Howdy folks, in this video we're going to be building a local ID using Power Query. What do I mean by a local ID? Well, it's the opposite of a global ID. And by that, I also mean that we're trying to avoid situations where we have a big, tall fact table that's got, lots and lots and lots of rows, and there's a unique identifier for each and every one of them because it compresses really, really poorly, right? Now, in general, whenever you have a unique identifier like that in a fact table, you want to throw it away. But when you throw it away, you have a problem in that there could be duplicate rows in there. It's not actually quite as common as you might think, but with some data, you'll have a bunch of duplicates, right? And so you say, oh no, if I have these duplicate rows in my tables, my DAX might get all messed up. Therefore, I'm going to leave a global identifier, it's going to be called an ID column, in my fact table so that I don't run into problems with those duplicate values. But it compresses really badly. So we've got a solution for it that will compress a lot better and give you most of the functionality that you want with that global ID. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Okay. So the data we want isn't even loaded yet. This is all Power Query stuff. So I'm going to pop over here to my query editor. And here's where you can see an example kind of what we're talking about. We're going to do two examples here, right? So here in the first example, imagine this is a SQL table, right? We've got a couple columns. We've got a transaction number, a date, a customer, and a sale amount. Now, this transaction number is the global ID, or usually just called an ID. And by that we mean that each and every value in this column is unique. That way, every single transaction has a unique value associated with it, right? So now this is only 16 rows, so you really wouldn't have to worry about it with this. But if you imagine this is, 160 million rows, this column is going to be really expensive because it basically doesn't compress at all because every single value is unique, right? So you might think to yourself, okay, so what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and, kind of lop it off. In fact, here, we'll kind of do it this way. I'm going to right click and I'm going to reference, I'm going to sort of simulate creating the fact table, right? So I'm going to say, all right, this is going to be my fact sales 1 table because we've got two examples. This will be the first one. Fact sales 1, right? So you might think to yourself, okay, you know what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and lop this off, and I'm just going to remove that. And boom, just like that, your data is going to compress way, way better because you've dropped that sort of globally unique column, right? But there's some problems in here, right? Like if we look at Carla right here on 7/10, Carla spent $5 probably for a cup of coffee or something like that. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. So there are actually 4 completely duplicate rows, right? Or I guess 3 duplicate rows. So there's this one up here where for Carla we've got on 7/10 she spent $5, and then that exact same record appears here, here, and here, right? And so if you go to do some DAX over this, you could run into some problems because if you use a revisor, right, on this table, the revisor is going to pick up all of the 3 duplicate rows in addition to the one that you want, which is bad. So you say to yourself, oh no, life is terrible. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add that transaction number back in. And now you'll no longer have any problems with the DAX because there's no duplicate rows because each row by definition has this unique number associated with it. But you lose all that compression. So is there a way around it? Well, yeah, that's what this video is about. So let me show you a potential workaround for this, right? So I'm going to kind of leave this as is. Keeping in mind that the way we got here, in fact, I'll even do it again just so you can see it again. I'm going to delete this. You guys can probably hear my dogs in the background. They're very excited about this technique. Okay, so I can right-click and reference on that SQL table to go start building my fact table. And I'm going to call this fact sales 1 because it's the first example. The second example will be fact sales 2. Okay. We can't dump the transaction number column because, well, we want to, but we can't because we've got all these duplicate records. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go over here to example 1 SQL table, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to start building a transaction number that is local just to that particular date, right? So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then when it gets to the next day, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever again. And then every time you get to a new day, that number resets, right? So because of that, if you've got the combination of the date and that number, you now have no duplicate records, which will be pretty efficient, right? Okay, so here's how we get it. I'm going to right-click on example 1 SQL table, and I'm going to do reference, right? And so what this query right here is going to be, I'm going to right-click on it, uncheck enable because it's just a helper query. This is going to get, for every single date, it's going to get the first transaction number of that day. Speaking of which, I'm going to rename this, right? So let's call this example 1. I'm going to do a dash there, and I'm going to really make this long. For each day, get first transaction number. There we go. Okay, so that's the name of it. So why don't we go ahead and do that? For each day, go ahead and get the first transaction number. This is pretty easy. I'm going to right-click on date, and I'm going to do group by, right? So I'm going to say go get each and every date, all the unique values of the date column, then perform some aggregation, right? So there's only 3 days in this date table, so we'll end up with 3 rows, one for the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th. And for each one, what I want to get is the first transaction number, because that's the name of the query, right? So to do that, I'm going to type, that's the name of it, I'm going to do the min of the transaction number column, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now for every single date, both the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th, I've got the very first transaction number for that day, okay? So this is going to be my lookup table, right? So now I head back here to my sales table, my fact sales table, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to head up here to the home part of the ribbon, and I'm going to go to merge queries, and I'm going to merge against that lookup table. So I'm going to go pull example for each day, get first transaction number, right? And so now what I want to do is I want to base my join on the date column. So date to date right there, right? I could speed things up a little bit by making an inner join if you care about that. I'll just leave this as a left outer for simplicity. Just because it's the default. It's nice and easy. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and hit these bunny ears right here to expand out the results of that join. I'm going to uncheck use original column name as prefix. I'm going to uncheck that. And I'm also going to uncheck the date because we already have the date. What I actually want is for each and every day, I want the first transaction number, right? And so now, for the 9th, for every single instance of the 9th, for every single transaction that happened on the 9th, I also have the very first transaction number of the 9th, right, which is 1. For the 10th, for every single transaction on the 10th, those, I guess, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 transactions on the 10th, I have the very first transaction number, which happens to be 6 right there. So I've got 6 all the way down. And then for all the transactions on the 11th, right, those transactions right there, I've got the very first transaction number for the 11th, which is that number 12 right there. So it says 12, 12, 12, 12, 12. So what do I do with this? Well, you might see where I'm going. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to reorder these so you can sort of see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'm going to take this column and just drag it over here, right? So I've got the transaction number for each and every actual transaction, and I've got the first transaction number for each date, right? So I'm going to take this, I'm going to control click on this, I'm going to head up here to add column, and I'm going to go find my little calculator, and where it says standard, I'm going to click on that, and I'm just going to click on subtract, right? And so now, what I've got is I've got the transaction number for that day, right? So this is the first transaction, the second, third, fourth, fifth, and then when we get to the next day, when we go from the 9th to the 10th, when we go from the 9th to the 10th, it goes from incrementing, it goes ahead and resets, and it starts back at 0. Now, if an end user isn't going to see this, this is probably just fine. I actually find that a lot of people actually like this idea of the transaction number of that day. They want to actually see this in visuals, and therefore, A, we want to give it a better name. But more importantly, we want to start counting at 1, not 0, because most people that run into this kind of stuff, they're not programmers, they're not computer people. They don't want to think in terms of starting counting at 0. So to do that, I'm going to make this nice and easy. Up here in the formula bar, which if you can't see it, you could go turn on the formula bar. There in the formula bar, when I clicked on the little calculator, it added this step for me, and it added the formula right there. So for every row, right now it gets the transaction number, and it subtracts the first transaction number for that day. I guess maybe I should have renamed that. So what I want to do is I just want to add 1 to each one of these. So I'm going to click right here, right after the H right there. I'm going to add a space. I'm just going to do 1 plus. 1 plus, which just should make all these 1 bigger. The result of which is, yeah, go ahead, hit enter. Now, for every single row, we have the transaction number of that day, but it starts counting at 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When it goes from 5 back to 1, we know we've gone from that day to the next day. Also, the name of this isn't very good. I could double click right here and rename it there, but what the heck? I'm already adding this stuff in the formula bar, which is where I like to do a lot of my work. Here where it says subtraction, see where it says subtraction there and it says subtraction there? Not a coincidence. So I'm going to double click right there, and I'm going to call this thing, let's call it the daily transaction number. So the transaction number for that day. Good. So now that I've got the daily transaction number, right, I could go ahead and get rid of this and this, which is good because once I get rid of specifically this one right here, I go ahead and remove that column that has such high cardinality and therefore poor compression. So I'm going to go click on remove columns, and there we go. So now for every single date, I could go ahead and move this over there, right? So for every single date, I've got both the date and I have the transaction number of that day. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it goes from the 9th to the 10th, and it starts counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then when it goes from the 10th to the 11th, it starts counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. So now I have no duplicate records, plus I get rid of that column that compresses so poorly and replace it with this one, which compresses nicely. And also, end users do like to see this. They like to see this automatrix. Oh, it's the 34th transaction of the day. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes I don't know why they like to see it, but they sure like to see it. And a lot of times it's even more useful than the global transaction number, which is kind of meaningless. Who cares that it's transaction, 1,478,000? Nobody cares. Okay. So let's do this one more time. And I'm going to do it with a bit of a twist, wherein we start with data that looks like this. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and remove these last two steps just so you can see me do it, right? We start with pretty similar data where we've got a transaction number which compresses absolutely terribly. We have a timestamp column which also compresses absolutely terribly because all these values are going to be unique and all these values are probably going to be unique or very, very close, right? And then we've got the customer and the sale amount. So what I want to do is sort of the same trick we had before, but rather than having a transaction number that is local to the date, I'm going to make it local to both the date and the hour. And here's how we're going to do that. So to start, we know we want to get rid of this column and this column because they compress so poorly. So I'm going to click on timestamp, and I'm going to actually do this right in the SQL table version of this, right? I'm going to head up here to add column, and I'm going to go to date, and I'm going to click on date only, just to extract the date part of it, right? Whenever you see a column that has a timestamp in it where you've got both the date and the time, you should always at least extract out the date part because you almost never ever need this information down to the millisecond, right? Now, normally you could do what I've done here where you get the date and then you can just go ahead and get rid of this timestamp column because you don't need it. But we're actually going to get the hour out as well because we think the combination of date and hour will mean that we have fewer unique values in our sort of local ID, so it'll compress even better, okay? So I'm going to click on timestamp right here. I'm going to head up here to add column. And this time I'm not going to go to date, I'm going to go to time. And I'm going to go down to hour, I'm just going to click on hour, right? And so we've got 8, 8, 9, 11, 14, that's 2 o'clock for people that aren't used to looking at time that way. It's sort of military time or, time that the way you read it in a lot of places around the world. Regardless of how you want to look at it, right? Now, for every single transaction, we have the date that it happened and the hour that it happened. Now, you could also pull out the seconds if you wanted, the minutes and the seconds and even the milliseconds if you wanted to. But I think the combination of date and hour is going to be more than enough information for us. So now that we've got date and hour, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to just remove this timestamp. I don't want that. Okay, go away. Okay, good. So now we can start building out our fact table. So I'm going to right-click over here and do reference, right? So this is our source SQL table. This is going to be our fact table. So I'm going to call this fact sales 2, mainly because this is the second example, right? That's all I mean by 2 right there, okay? So now, for every single transaction, we've got the transaction number, and we've also got the date and the hour associated with it. And these compress quite poorly. By the way, I guess I didn't mention it before. You probably could have guessed. There are rows in this table where if we got rid of the transaction number, we run into a problem. Specifically, duplicate rows, right? So Carla spends $5 there and there and there and there, and Dinesh spends $7 there and $7 there, right? So that's why we can't just get rid of this transaction number, right? But we want to make it local. We want to make it local to the date and the hour. Right now, it's just going to keep going up by 1 every single row, which means it's going to compress horribly. What we want is for every single day and hour, right, it'll start going up, and then when you get to the next hour, it'll reset again, right? So it'll go 1 and then 2, and since we go from the 8 a.m. block to the 9 a.m. block, it'll go 1, 2, and then 1 again, right? So it'll compress really, really well. Okay, so let's head back to our example 2 SQL table. Now I need to create my lookup table. So I'm going to right-click on this and do reference, and I'm going to call this example 2, and I'm going to do a dash. And what did I call it before? I called it for each day get first transaction number. Well, this is pretty close to that. So we're going to say for each day, and hour get first transaction number. Yeah, it's getting a bit verbose. My apologies. But that's what we're doing, right? For each day and hour, we want to get the first transaction number, right? So what I want to do is not just the first transaction for the date, but for the date and the hour. First transaction for the date and the hour. So this is pretty easy. I click on date. I control-click on hour. I right-click. I go down to group by. And I say, okay, for each combination of date and hour, what do you want to get? Well, I want to get the first transaction number. And I'm going to make this even more verbose because why not? So it's going to be the first transaction number per day per hour. There we go. And so to get it, I'm not going to do the count rows. I'm going to do the minimum of the transaction number. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. There we go. Now, for every single date, for every single hour, I have the first transaction number associated with that date and hour combination. Ooh, that's fancy. Okay, now before I head back to my fact sales 2 table, I'm going to right-click on this guy and uncheck Enable Load because this is a helper query. It's only going to help us populate fact sales 2, right? So now that we've got that, we can head back to fact sales 2. Head back to fact sales 2, and I head over here to Home, and I click on Merge Queries. And what I want to do is, for every single transaction, I want to go get the first transaction number associated with that date and hour, which we have in our lookup table. So I come over here, I go to example 2. For each day and hour, get the first transaction number, right? And now I want to join not just on date, but on date and hour. So I click on date, then I control-click on hour. Then down here, I click on date, then control-click on hour. If you prefer to click on hour and then date, you could definitely do that. But you would also have to do it in the same order down here. So it doesn't matter which order you pick as long as it's consistent between the top and the bottom. Okay, to speed things up a little bit, I could change this from a left outer join to an inner join. But to keep things simple, I'm just going to go ahead and use the default, just because it's easy to remember because you don't have to remember anything. Just use the default. Okay, so I go ahead and I click OK, right? I've got, oh gosh, what a long name that is. Who cares about the long name? I just want to pull out the first transaction number. So I'm going to click on the little bunny ears. I don't need the date. I don't need the hour. What I want is for every single transaction, I want the first transaction number per day per hour. So I go ahead and click OK. Good, 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 good. So now, if I get my transaction number over here and kind of drag it over. So this is the global transaction number. So for every single row, this is unique, and it goes up by 1 every single row. But what we could see is that for each hour block, we could see that the first transaction per day per hour is 1, 1. So both of these transactions happen in the first day in the first hour, right? And then when we get here, we see that this one right here is part of the second hour block, okay? So if I take the transaction number for each transaction and subtract the transaction for that day and that hour, the very first one, what I'll get is a number unique to that particular date and hour. So we'll get the transaction number for that date and for that hour. Hey, let's just do it, right? Talking about it's complicated. Let's just do it. So I click on transaction number. I control-click on first transaction number per day per hour. I head up here to add column. I find the little calculator-looking button because I want to do calculator-looking stuff. I click on it, and I choose subtract because I want to subtract the second column from the first column. Click on subtract right there, and boom. Look how well this is going to compress, right? I've only got 3 unique values in there. That 2 pops up right there, right? I've got 0 and 1, and eventually I have a 2. Gosh, this is going to compress really, really well. But again, this is going to be the thing that people sometimes want to actually see. They want to see the transaction number for that hour, right? So we don't want it to start counting at 0. So what I'm going to do is up here in the formula, where it says each transaction number minus first transaction number per day per hour, I'm going to click in between the H and that first little square bracket right there, and I'm going to do a 1 plus. And go ahead, hit enter, which will cause all those to jump up by 1. So now that's the first transaction of that particular hour. That's the second transaction of that hour. There's the first one. That hour only has 1. That hour only has 1. That hour only has 1. And then we come down here. Oh, in this hour, that's the first transaction of the hour and the second transaction of the hour, and so on and so forth. Until we get down here where there's actually 1, 2, 3 transactions in that particular hour. Okay, good. But the name of this probably shouldn't be subtraction. I could double click on it and change the name there, but heck, as long as we're changing the formulas up here in the formula bar, let's just click up here. So where it says subtraction right there, and it says subtraction right there, not a coincidence. I'm going to double click on subtraction. And in the formula bar, I'm going to call this the hourly transaction number. If I wanted to be more specific, I could call it the daily hourly transaction number, but I think for most end users, when you say hour, they assume it means for that hour, for that day. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Boom. Now I've got an hourly transaction number, which is a local ID, right? It creates a uniqueness to each one of these records without having to have this big, ugly transaction number where every single row is globally unique, but it compresses so poorly. Speaking of which, I could click on transaction number, and I could control click on first transaction number per day per hour, and I could right click and remove columns because we really want to get rid of that one because it compresses so very poorly. Okay, good. Okay, good. So now I could rearrange the order of these guys a little bit. In fact, why don't I do that just to make it a little bit nicer to look at? So I'm going to take hourly transaction, move it right there, and I'll take this and kind of move it over there, and take this and move it over there. Ah, there we go. Ah, that's a little nicer. So for each day, right? No, in fact, let me move this there, right? So for each day, for each hour, we could see the hour transaction number, right? The transaction number for that particular hour, right? We could see who bought the thing and how much they spent. So now we no longer have duplicate records, which means we can write DAX much more freely without worrying about having errors in there. And the column that creates that uniqueness is going to compress incredibly well. Incredibly well. Only 3 unique values. Now, in practice, you will have more than 3 unique values, but it's going to be a whole lot better than that incrementing column that you start off with. Okay, so this is a pretty cool trick. It can really squeeze a lot of performance out of a decent-sized table. I sure do hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.